Welcome to GRI Global Hospitality Committee's August session. I'm Lisa Engel, Managing Director of Barclay Capital Group and Chair of the committee. We are pleased to share with you our keynote presentation by Michael Grove, Managing Director EMEA at HotStats, who discusses first half 2020 hotel performance and key takeaways across EMEA, APAC, and Americas.
Thank you for inviting me today. So just going to start, I guess I've seen some familiar faces in the crowd here, but I think it's just important to just touch on it and look at the UK here being the market that we have the oldest data for, I guess, in the UK. So we're able to go back some time. And just looking at the previous crisis, it's nothing new to share with you that GOPPAR takes almost double the amount of time that TRevPAR takes to return. And of course, when comparing that to RevPAR, we will look at TRevPAR, and again, I'll elaborate on that a little bit. The main reason for this, as I have been pretty much on every presentation for the last few months, is to really indicate and just to drive home, this is direct from the hotel P&L. So there's little opinion involved here. We've never seen anything like this situation ever before. So the biggest drops that we saw, for instance, after the global financial crisis and the impacts to the travel industry after 9/11, they're looking at 30% down in the UK's performance here. And of course, the current situation, we were well over 100% as things stand. The numbers are as of June. I'm looking at the year-to-date performance here, so just give you a kind of a snapshot as things stand for June 2020. You see the macro regions we're looking at below here: Asia Pacific, USA, Europe, and the Middle East. The orange is the 2020 number and 2019 right next to it. And I think the key thing to understand when looking at year-to-date performance, I've tried to stay away from it actually as much as possible in today's and try looking at it on a month-by-month basis, mainly because there's so much inconsistency in the way the virus impacted different regions. So for instance, Asia Pacific, in particular China, the numbers were impacted from January, whereas for some of the other markets, it's as late as the end of March, possibly even into April. So the year-to-date numbers include some kind of level of normality, as it would be within the numbers, and that needs to be considered when comparing regions. You can see, for instance, the blue line, which is the lowest line that drops. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but basically January is the first impact month for China. You see how much February was impacted. There's no other region that felt anything like the impact that China felt in February on a year-on-year basis. And we're of course looking at profit numbers here, so GOPPAR change. So the various variables that we will talk about as well, being the top line numbers such as the occupancies, the changes in costs, and the way that the various governments were able to react to the crisis and support the industry will of course vary by region. But one thing that is, I think, quite interesting to see here is that if you look at, for instance, the UK, United States, and Germany's performance here, three markets that certainly within May and June were very different. So whereas the US had opened up the most of the hotel industry, or not even closed it in many states, the United Kingdom very much still closed down, and the actual impact on year-on-year GOP performance was actually very similar. So very much going back to that argument of when is the right time to reopen the hotels within the market. And of course, I think also understanding that there will be some ramp-up pain for pretty much everybody. Now looking at June versus June, so I guess more of a snapshot of a standard point in time. You see Asia Pacific finally in June as a region return to profit. I will go down one level so that we can see individual countries, but generally what we're looking at is the Asia Pacific has finally reached profit levels. And the July performance, we're presenting June at the moment because July is currently being finalized by the team. So next week we'll release that data. But right now we're looking at July, it will be very different when you look at Europe and the advances in the USA and in the Middle East. And of course, some kind of scale back or stabilizing of the Asia Pacific performance as it was on a very much an upward trajectory. And then I think as we've seen in July from various sources that there was a little bit of plateauing. Now dropping down to some kind of country level data here, again going back to what I was saying about the difference between the country being open or closed as it is, or the hospitality industry in that country being open or closed. Looking at the UK there on the left hand side, so you can see still in a loss making position. Actually, when you compare to the TRevPAR performance, which for June was just over £11 or just under $13, I think it is now. Those numbers actually were quite positive in the fact that there's been quite heavy support from the government. There's been a lot of course, the UK labour market means that there is availability to flex costs and lots of variable payroll within the hotel structures, which other countries possibly don't necessarily have to hand in these situations. Germany, Spain, right now I put Spain there because, of course, more recent events have meant that what was going into a positive period has made things quite difficult. China there as the kind of the only positive story. When you look at this picture, we predicted that when you get to 30% occupancy that we would start seeing profit in China, which we saw in May. And now as we've gone into June, the hotels are making money at a macro level. So of course the one thing that has kind of been a differentiator, like I said, with regards to government support, is that certain countries and the support at government level to support the employees using government funding, and of course the hotel industry not needing to make such rash decisions, but what it has meant that for those countries that have received that support from the governments, that there has been a kind of drop in payroll and possibly even a new baseline of payroll as we emerge up the other side of this. And I think that's a key consideration whenever looking at the historical break-even points or looking at hotel structures and previous margins, is the fact that we are basically going through a white paper review. We are with the clear indications here when you look at some of these numbers that we've basically started with almost a clean slate, and the payroll that was in the building was literally for use of security and the bare minimums to keep the building operating. What the orange is indicating here is the 2019 levels. So I guess the starting point. Again, there's a bit of seasonality to consider here. I chose April because that is the kind of middle month or the kind of the lowest point, I guess, in many circumstances here, looking at these various markets. So you're seeing the full impact, whereas March, I think, was half a month for many of the markets around Europe. April was a good starting point to look at year on year. And here you're seeing the value of drop. And some of these, of course, large swings based on a very high starting point. Now, all that taken into consideration, this is a break-even analysis that we put together prior to, so I think looking at the kind of March or April time, we started looking at this. It's just to give people some indication really as to understanding at which point hotels or different assets would or should break even based on historicals. And for all of the reasons I've just mentioned, this is an ever-changing situation. As part of that, it was important that we looked at not just the normal operation, but preempting the fact that hotels in most regions would need to open with bedrooms only or a very scaled-down version of what they were doing before. And that actually gave a very different picture from a break-even point of view, certainly in the luxury segment, which I think started quite a few conversations and questions. This is UK performance, and the orange on the right-hand side is looking at room-only operations. We removed any of the profits taken from the other operating departments, and the blue on the left-hand side is a normal operation, so a full operation. So you see the big gap there, in certainly in the luxury segment, and also in full service, the difference between running with rooms only or full operation. Now, early signs, it's still too early, and this is the caveat for many of these slides, and I guess some of the questions that you'll ask later, I'm sure, around the emerging data coming out the other side of where hotels are opening or markets are reopening. We really need stable data. This break-even analysis that we did was based on years of data on a macro level. And I think it's quite dangerous to start pulling conclusions from 1 or 2 months worth of data, although we do have access to easily enough of that. But I think it needs to stabilize. We need to look at it over a 3 to 6 month basis before we can really start understanding it. But just to give you an example here, if I look at the UK for May, we looked at 23% or 22% break-even point for hotels in general. And of course, looking at our break-even analysis, we would have been predicting approximately 40% in normal circumstance and 48% in a room-only operation. And again, then looking at for June, it was looking at just under 26%. So it's a much lower break-even point than it was prior to the crisis. But as things stabilize and as things emerge, expenses, I'm sure, will return into the hotel operations, because some of them you can't hold off forever, and they were, I guess, organically brought into the business in the first place. The other thing to consider, and I just wanted to raise this really at this point, some interest analysis based on European data. I presented this last week to a group, and I thought it'd be quite useful to just talk through this. We've put out a recent article in line with this. HFTP released some uniform system guidance based on the Global Financial Committee's guidance, which was around how to treat contracted business from government initiatives, so such as housing of key workers, quarantining, or even converting the hotel into a hospital. So there were guidance on how to treat that revenue that was generated from that. So under 80% with one contract would be seen as normal operation. Over 80%, but less than 100%, would have been considered as other revenue or miscellaneous revenue, but still costs attached within the hotel. And 100% if you're outsourced to a hospital or converted to a hospital would mean that the hospital staff would be servicing the guests, as it would be, or of course the patients, and therefore it would be classed as non-operating. So that actually has had quite a big impact on looking at numbers, and I think we need to understand that. The left-hand side, you'll see the pie as it was 2019, and looking at June 2020. The reason we're showing Europe is that Europe was the one that was mostly impacted by this. But you will see, for instance, some large changes, in particular miscellaneous revenues, where not only the reallocation of some of these revenues, but also for the first time that I've seen, being an ex-finance or hotel finance guy myself, was the large amount of business interruption claims that were successful, and how that has impacted other revenue. So, like I said, RevPAR, less than 50% of the TrevPAR for UK performance in June, and that's a key one to understand, and another reason why we focus on TrevPAR. Looking at the US performance here by asset type, so again, just trying to understand how each asset type has managed to, I guess, ride the storm as it is. No major surprises to see that extended stay and select service quite close together, and have managed to maintain some kind of occupancy, and have returned sharper than the full service. You see that huge drop off in full service performance, and how that has continued to be much lower at this current point in time. So that's certainly one to look out for. You can certainly see the relationship at this stage with occupancy and GOPPAR, and what that is meaning from an asset point of view. The key things that came out of the discussions that we were having regarding the break-even analysis was that you couldn't necessarily, the rooms only side of things, I think, indicated that it wasn't just a case of premium pricing for the luxury segment and the occupancy-led strategy of the select service, but it was also a mixture of the existing cost base for the full service and luxury segment, mixed with the TrevPAR, the opportunity for ancillary revenues for guests in the full service operation. So those three kind of the cost base, the premium pricing, and the ability to drive TrevPAR seem to be the kind of winning formula for getting to the break-even point quickest. Here's so further indication really of that change in business mix, revenue mix. You can see here the uniform system guidance was released in March, and what that has meant throughout this period. And of course, again, the increase in business interruption claims, and how that has impacted the revenue mix. So we were also trying to, I guess, predict or give some analysis on using our data on the impact on F&B. I can run through this in detail with anybody who's interested, but I think for this purpose, I'll stay at summary level. We were looking, excluding room service, that countries that adopted the 1 meter distancing, which was the WHO guidance, would look at being able to achieve 31% or lose 69% of their F&B revenues, excluding room service. And I guess the prediction was the room service revenues would increase. And what that we've actually seen is some large drop-offs in the bar and in the restaurant, as anticipated. But the extreme increases in room service revenues on a per occupied room basis has been huge. Certainly in the Middle East, where being able to serve 2 guests in the room, certainly the type of operations in the likes of the UAE, are very foodie destinations, I guess. And the requirement is to be able to service that. That will monitor that over time to see how that continues. continues. But I think as these markets reopen and the F&B space is limited, room service is, of course, a natural option. The other angle to look at on the emerging view of hotel P&Ls is the change in segmentation. I think the interesting point of looking at APAC here on the left-hand side, which is, I guess, more stabilized compared to the other regions. I hesitate to say that, but certainly more advanced in the graph as it is. The very, very similar levels or very similar split of segmentation. What this is looking at is volume mix. So it is the total kind of rooms sold and dividing that, chopping that up into the various segments. So what I've done in orange is combined best available rate and leisure, in blue, which is corporate and conference, and then of course in grey, the tours and leisure groups. And I think that's really kind of amazing to see that in certainly in Asia Pacific, like I said, it stayed very very flat. In USA, the picture is very much that bar and leisure is leading the way, and there's seen that large drop off in corporate and conference. In Europe, I think we can take some assumption, and that has been the feedback from the operators so far, that this corporate and conference that we're seeing in Europe is because much of the business, many of the rooms that are being occupied are government related, and with government falling into that segment, that will obviously drive higher room nights. Again, key markets in Europe are only just opening, so we should really monitor that. That will change, I'm sure, as flights have been opened and the hotels are able to operate properly. And the Middle East, similar picture there. You're seeing the likes of the government initiatives. They're holding these rooms. There has been an increase in leisure demand as the flight paths have opened and accessibility, etc. But they've been holding a lot of expats, of course, in many of these Middle East countries. So on a global level, this is occupancy by segment. This is actually looking in a slightly different way. Here you're seeing the actual occupancy of each segment, so the rooms sold divided into the total rooms available. And what you're seeing on a global level is that leisure is generally leisure and bar are leading the way, although not very much. It's not a huge gap. It's still very low. We're still in very low occupancies on a global level, and of course on a macro view, it doesn't always show the truest picture as I guess it would be. If you look at it by region, you see here Europe still very flat lines. This only really becomes important when you start seeing the upshoots of occupancy. Here we're still very flat, so I wouldn't really take this as a clear indication. Throughout from April basically until June, you'll see that bar has held its own, and conferencing, for instance, has stayed fairly flat. Asia Pacific, so showing a very similar story, I guess, that leisure, you see here this upward spike is really actually indicating that since March we have seen this upshoot in leisure occupancy, and some corporates also returning, but again, mostly driven by China's performance. This region will heavily be impacted, certainly with our sample. And of course the US, where you're seeing that the other end of this is very much leisure again, leisure and bar. And I guess domestic travel is going to be a key one in the US as we come up the other side of this situation. So I guess in summary, the things that I wanted to just kind of leave you with is that I believe that all of our evidence so far shows that the break-even points that we are seeing initially are based on quite large drops in costs. Some areas of fixed costs that you wouldn't really imagine would have been available to drop in a normal circumstance. Certainly in seasonal hotels where the hotel is closed seasonally, some of these costs remain in the business because they need to, whereas they've not been kind of left in the business when it comes to this current situation. As we emerge of the other side of this, there will be the likes of servicing of equipment and things that we've been able to hold off. The temporary service levels, I guess, may not be permanent, and you should see some return of those costs into the business. So don't trust the break-even point, I guess, is the use as a guide, an initial guide, but not necessarily understand that that's not where it's going to sit. The hotel revenue mix, when looking at it currently, I think TrevPAR personally, as I go on to the next comment, is that I think TrevPOR and TrevPAR are vital metrics coming up the other side of this, as we understand the best use of our space, benchmarking against the competition. Of course, I'm going to say that, but I think it's vital that understanding as budget is kind of out of the window, and last year is not really much of a valid metric. Understanding how you are best using the space versus the competition, I think, is a vital skill to be involved in right now. And of course, that revenue mix will normalise in some way as the hotels reopen properly and the percentage of the business is not coming from the likes of these local authority initiatives. That said, of course, there are still business interruption claims that will continue, and they are, of course, quite large amounts in many circumstances.